We obtain data from our units of analysis using one of two major methods of study. The first, which we've already talked about, is an observational study. The second, which we're going to start talking about now, is an experiment. Experiments involve a deliberate intervention in the environment in order to observe what happens to a response variable. So in an experimental setting, unlike with observational studies, the researcher purposefully manipulates variables and intervenes in the environment. The reason we do this is to determine cause and effect. We want to see if we can ascertain that changes in an explanatory variable are causing an effect in a response variable. This may be suggested with an observational study, but cannot be shown to be the case unless we're conducting an experiment. Here are the conditions that are necessary to determine cause and effect relationship. First, we have temporal precedence. That's a pretty ominous sounding name, isn't it? But the fact is that all it means is the cause must be before the response. That is, we change the explanatory variable before we observe a change in the response variable. Obviously, if we observe a change in the response variable before the explanatory variable has changed, then it cannot be the explanatory variable that is causing an effect on the response. This is known as temporal precedence. Cause must come before response. Second, we have to have covariation of variables. That means they must be correlated. The explanatory and response variables vary together. There's an association. We already know that we can establish association with an observational study. Well, we have to establish it with experiments as well in order to show cause and effect. And here's the big difference between an experiment and an observational study. In order to ascertain cause and effect, we have to eliminate alternative explanations. That is, we have to make sure it's not extraneous variables that are causing the association. And the way we do that is to control them. That's where the intervention comes in. We actually do things in experiments to control extraneous variables. By its very nature, in an observational study, we are not controlling extraneous variables. And that's why we cannot ascertain for sure that there's a cause and effect relationship of the explanatory and response. So now the question becomes, how do we do these three things? We use experiments, and we have components of experiments that I'd like to go over with you, and then we're going to start putting it together into examples. In an experiment, we often call the explanatory variable the independent variable. I reserve that name independent variable for when we're actually manipulating that variable as an experimenter. So an independent variable and explanatory variable are the same thing in an experiment, but the only time I call it independent variable is in an experiment. Similarly, the only time I call a response variable a dependent variable is in an experiment. The idea of an independent and dependent variable is that the independent variable is causing changes in the dependent variable, and in other kinds of studies we don't know that to be the fact, so I don't use those terms. We also have in an experiment some sort of intervention, and that's a treatment. It's a specific intervention provided to some, not all the units in a study, but some of the units. When the units being studied are people, they are usually called the participants of the study. Okay, so those are the components of experiments. Now we need some examples. The first example I'm going to give is considered a weak experiment. I would not recommend one of these, but I'm giving you an example so that you can understand why it's a weak experiment, and recognize it if you see this in the research literature. Here's an example. Freshmen entering college were enrolled in a University 101 course designed to acquaint them with university life, for instance, campus resources, study routines, university rules. At the end of the semester, these students were assessed on their understanding of university life, and they're being assessed at the end of the semester to see if they knew more at the end of the semester about university life than they might have before. Well, guess what? Do you need to participate in University 101 to know more about a university, or could you simply be a student at the university? Here's what makes this a weak design. We're looking at one treatment, University 101, for one group, and that's not a true experiment. For a true experiment, we have to have at least two different conditions. Let's go ahead and look at one and contrast. Dr. Frankenstein created 20 monster clones. He put 10 monsters in a room with piles of books. He put the other 10 monsters in a room with a big TV. After 2 months, he assessed the literacy skills of all the monsters. So now look what's happening. The monsters are being divided into two groups. One group goes to books, one group goes to TV. Since these monsters are clones to begin with, and obviously this is not a realistic study, but I'm using it as an example to introduce experiments, and then we're going to talk about the more messiness of experiments. But when we have clones rather than people, we have monsters that are all going to behave the same way unless we give them different environments. We've taken out any biological differences. We've created clones. So if when we look at the outcomes, these monsters differ, the books monsters differ from the TV monsters, well, guess what? We can say that whether they read books or watched TV is what made the difference. And that's what we're trying to do in an experiment. So the major difference in weak and strong experiments is whether we're able to account for extraneous variables. If so, then we can attribute changes in the response variable to changes in the explanatory variable. Okay, so in this video, what I've done is started to introduce you to the idea of researcher intervention in order to establish cause and effect. We talked about a few terms that we'd use. We talked about a few elements of experiments that we'd use. And I showed you two kind of bizarre examples on the two ends of the spectrum. One, a weak experiment showing you that all we do is give a treatment to everyone and then expect to find outcomes at the end, but we can't establish cause and effect that way. And then a very strong experiment, except unrealistic because we're using clones, so there's really not any extraneous variables. What I'm going to do in the next video is to talk about what we call experimental designs, in which we design experiments in order to account for extraneous variables.